In our respective spheres of existence, we often fail to recognize the massive movements of change happening across the world. Right now in Hong Kong, one of the largest public movements is underway. As China begins to erase the borders between themselves and Hong Kong, public opposition has formed at nearly every level. Today, we see protests that have become increasingly violent, but also ones that have formed the vision representative of this modern fight for democracy. The history of Hong Kong goes back approximately 2 centuries ago. It was originally a part of China, but was forcefully handed over to the British Empire following the First Opium War in 1842. By 1984, Britain and China came to an agreement to revert the rule of Hong Kong back to Chinese control starting in the year 1997. This would create one country under 2 systems of government, which were to remain intact for a minimum of 50 years after the official handover.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I should like, on behalf of Her Majesty the Queen and of the entire British people, to express our thanks, admiration, affection, and good wishes to all the people of Hong Kong who have been such staunch and special friends over so many generations.
As an economic powerhouse in the Eastern Hemisphere under a capitalistic economic system with partial democracy, Hong Kong was an extremely valuable asset. Before long, however, Beijing tried to manipulate the special administrative region that is Hong Kong and capitalize on their success. 5 years after the handover, Beijing tried to implement a reform in which Hong Kong would have to get approval to pass future reforms. Britain accused the Beijing government of meddling with the contract, and the incident only further fed the flames of democracy inside the borders of Hong Kong. During the 2000s, the second chief executive, Donald Tsang, pushed for democratic reform but was limited by the Beijing government. Due to this, the time frame he worked out was not soon enough in the eyes of the people. In the 2010s, the people of Hong Kong took an unofficial vote that would allow Hong Kong to shortlist candidates for the chief executive position. Mainland China declared it illegal and put a stop to it, enraging the people of Hong Kong. By 2014, democratic protests began. Protests would vary in length and amount of people participating, but each one focused on changing Hong Kong legislation in a way to become more democratic. The movement, nicknamed the Umbrella Movement, was named due to the people using umbrellas to shield themselves from the police's efforts to counteract the protesters. An NPR podcast posted in October of this year, called Umbrellas Up, interviewed those directly involved in the protests. Fear was a common theme among these activists. One woman described her birthday as a countdown for every year until the bomb of communist China explodes and takes her freedom. Catherine, an active member of the protests, stated that the goals were to get the police to retreat and to stand guard for as long as possible. She detailed a blue-dyed water that was sprayed onto people by police which burned their skin, and was used to mark those who were involved for their arrests. Catherine also spoke to the violence of protesters, saying that it was necessary to get the attention of the government. Despite her active role, she feels pessimistic towards the situation since she knows that change won't be implemented, but she still will continue to protest, as will others, to not give in to obedience willingly and to take away the satisfaction from China. Others who were interviewed expressed fear when talking about the extradition bill, uncertain of what will happen to them. Millions of cameras with facial recognition are being placed around Hong Kong to keep an eye on the people. When the government decided to keep the extradition bill despite protests, a girl said the moment was unforgettable and it was the first time she saw police brutality with her own eyes on protesters. She said if they lose, they will leave behind their attempt and encourage change. To fully understand the Hong Kong perspective, it must be realized that many of the protesters are sincerely afraid of their rights and freedoms being taken away in less than 50 years.
China cannot help itself when it comes to, molding a kind of Hong Kong that it wants. However, based on what we can see, Beijing really has bigger fishes to fry, as it were. Hong Kong is important, but there are the trade wars, there are all sorts of problems such as China's handling of the Western territories, Northwest territories, the Uyghur. So those things are very much engaging the attention of Beijing. So Hong Kong needs to be taken care of, but it does not command the full attention of China.
While much of the world's media and political systems are in favor of the Hong Kong citizens, it must be known that there are two sides to every story. The differences between right and wrong depend on who you ask. In this case, the lesser-known news revolves around China's perspective on the issue at hand. It is strange that Beijing has refrained from making significant efforts to crack down on the protesters, since they have the power to do so.
This is not to say that they don't want to have control. The question is how. The long-term strategy is very simple. Because if you think about it, the basic law is only supposed to last for 50 years, counting from 1997. So what happens after 50 years? Legally, China can do whatever it wants.
Some scholars think they are simply waiting out the protests as they recognize that life must return to normal at some point. Chinese citizens believe that these protests are pointless since Hong Kong is so dependent on the mainland enough as it is. Many of China's ways have already been incorporated into Hong Kong society, educationally, socially, and economically. Over the past 5 months, these protests, both peaceful and violent, have seen an overwhelming amount of response from the police force that practically resides in the streets. Protesters have been shot with rubber bullets, doused with pepper spray, incapacitated with tear gas, physically assaulted, and shot with live rounds. With these events going on, international attention has also been drawn in. At 10 a.m. on the 17th of November, Hong Kong protesters were attempting to stop other Hong Kong citizens from clearing roadblocks that the protesters had set up around a local university. The police intervened and announced around 9 p.m. that night that those arrested inside of the campus will be facing riot charges upon prosecution. From the 19th until the 27th, riot police prevented the protesters from leaving the university. Protesters who attempted to make their way towards the police cordon around the campus were attacked with tear gas. With their strength and resilience diminishing day by day, the protesters needed to evacuate. Desperate for escape, students ziplined under the university bridges and even went through sewage systems to leave the campus. By the 29th, the police cordon had been lifted, with over 1,000 arrests having been made. With as much traction that these protests have gained in national media, it's no surprise that the United States has had something to say about it. Although it had originally been introduced in 2014, the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act finally gained attention after this most recent round of protests. The act passed both houses of Congress almost unanimously and was signed by President Trump on the 27th of November. What the act does specifically is impose sanctions on those involved with the human rights violations in Hong Kong. It ensures that the Department of State has annual reviews on the changing political status of Hong Kong and how it will relate to the United States. From 1842 to 1997, Hong Kong was a British colony. Over the past 22 years, Hong Kong's transition back to Chinese rule has been riddled with tension. While minor protests have occurred before 2014, most of the major ones have come from the umbrella movement that began after 2014, with the goal being to further democracy in Hong Kong. The recent extradition bill that was passed has sparked some of the largest and longest-lasting protests that have been documented. The citizens of Hong Kong have expressed their fears over their uncertainty for the future. This has been a substantial driving force for the protests to uphold democratic principles. Protesters mention the horrors of tear gas, water cannons, and other tactics used by police to stop them from protesting, but they remain persistent in their cause. The citizens of China have come to be tired of the violence of these prolonged protests and their international spotlight. At the same time, the protesters of Hong Kong have come to be tired of the oppression by the Beijing government on their city. Current law enforcement techniques have resulted in human rights concerns due to citizens being assaulted without reason, inciting responses from foreign nations. Still, a possible resolution seems bleak for protesters. Despite the courage and determination of the Hong Kong protesters, China would be an unlikely candidate to enact such changes. By 2047, the protests may have concluded, but their valiant efforts will not be forgotten.